Hi, everybody. This is State Senator Sean McCann, and I represent Kalamazoo County in the state legislature for Michigan. And it's great to join you today. This is our new world with video connections, and so what I want to do is just trying to go over a few things that we weren't able to talk about meeting in person with Dr. Keel's class and with an eye towards Earth Day coming up in the next week or so. So forgive me if I'm looking down a little bit, but I wanted to make some notes and talk about some things that we wanted to cover this morning, and we'll try to keep this brief and to the point. So, um, we had Earth Day first declared in 1970, and some great things sort of happened right on the heels of that. There was the Clean Air Act from 1970, the Clean Water Act from 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And those have held up well and done a lot of good in our country since then. But as you can imagine, there's still a long ways to go. And so some of the critical priorities that I want to state going forward are things that are on my mind, but on both the national and the state level. And I just want to add that one of the standing committees I serve on in the state Senate is the Energy and Technology Committee. So one of the things that comes right from that is our need to address climate change, both at the state level and at the federal level, and increase across our country and in the state of Michigan our renewable energy percentage. So that's one of the things that I do every day in my work as a senator is an eye towards renewable energy and how can we have our utilities in the state of Michigan keep increasing their renewable energy portions. And I'm happy to say that I think there's good progress and utilities are embracing the need for this both through their shareholders and from outside pressure from citizens and the Public Service Commission and ratepayers alike. So the other thing that happened, unfortunately, on a national level is our withdrawal from the climate accords, the Paris Climate Accords. And in response to that, when Governor Whitmer was elected, she insisted that the state of Michigan be a part of a governor's coalition that represents the same values as the climate accord, so that we at least know that with the national leadership lacking, that the state level leadership embraces these needed priorities going forward. Also just sort of, as a piece of the COVID crisis at this point, on top of what happened with the oil markets, we now have a world awash in oil and low prices, but that can't stop our momentum for our need to be reliant on renewable energy. So, there may be these times when people say, well, gas is so cheap, oil is so cheap, we'll just use that instead. We have to make sure that we keep pushing a long-term sustainable future for our country. We have big threats to our water and our human health through consumption of water. We've seen things like PCBs, lead, PFAS in our water systems, and we need to do everything we can to keep working on cleaning these issues up out of our waterways. Think about Flint and Parchment, Michigan, which is a community in my district that had PFAS turn up in its water supply. Think about Oscoda, where the Wurtsmith Air Force Base used firefighting foam and trainings to put PFAS unknowingly into the lakes and on the shores of Lake Huron. So know that on a daily basis and weekly basis, we are keeping track of the current crisis of PFAS in our communities and across the state of Michigan. But we can't forget about things like lead removal and PCBs. And it just reminds me really of even the fact that we have let these things come into our environment in the first place without making sure that they do no harm before we put them into our community. Even thinking about asbestos, for example, PFAS, PCBs, lead pipes, all these things have turned out in hindsight to be toxic and needed to be removed. And we really should be thinking about not putting these things into our communities in the first place until we know they're safe. So let's talk about threats to our Great Lakes. The top threat is Line 5 and the need to shut that down. And know that my position has not changed, nor has the governor's or the attorney general's, that this is a ticking time bomb in the Straits of Mackinac, and it needs to be shut down immediately. So we still are watching that in this time of crisis with COVID-19 and stand ready to try to shut that down at any juncture. I've worked on the Senate Natural Resources Committee looking at addressing phosphorus and algae blooms in our Great Lakes and looking at measures to address that and have our agricultural industry be aware and working towards a less phosphorus generating system so that we don't continue to have these terrible algae blooms in the Great Lakes, especially in Lake Erie. And lastly, the cost that we're facing now as water levels from our Great Lakes rise to record highs. Inland lakes are flooded. There's so much damage being created by really the fact that we have not anticipated and known that we would hit situations with record high water levels and all the costs that come with that. So it's going to be a very difficult, painful, and expensive time as we deal with these record water levels. And lastly, just talking about recycling and the need to do more recycling and the need to reduce the use of our plastic. One thing I would point out is that I've introduced now multiple times, and again as a state senator, the bill to expand the 10-cent deposit on water bottles, to expand it to water bottles and other containers beyond the current 10-cent deposit allowed. So that may be a bill that may not progress through the legislature, but maybe that's something we can get on the ballot or look for ways to change the leadership in Lansing so that they embrace this priority. And on that note, I would just say that we do have good state leadership at the executive level. I mentioned Governor Whitmer, Attorney General Nessel, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, but the legislative chambers are led by the other party, and those are still very resistant to addressing some of these priorities that we've laid out. There's an opportunity to change the House of Representatives leadership this fall and flip that chamber, and certainly myself and many others are going to be engaged in changing the federal leadership and getting a new president. So let me just wrap up now with a talk about COVID-19 and some of parallels that we have and lessons we can learn that relate to climate change. COVID-19 has turned out to be a global problem that's had very real local impact. And if we look at the fact that inaction and lack of preventative measures only exacerbate global crises, and that's the same is true with COVID-19 and climate change. And we're working very hard to lower the curve for COVID-19 to not overwhelm our healthcare system. And we also need to lower the curve of carbon dioxide output into our environment. It becomes very real when people see these viruses attacking their loved ones, but we're going to see people perish and suffer in light of climate change as well. So this is a vital issue for our public health, for jobs, and at the end of the day, it's our moral obligation. So that's a lot of material. I hadn't planned to talk this long, but I felt that these things were really important to cover, and I encourage you to reach out to my office, be in contact anytime, and I look forward to working with you down the road, and we'll have as happy an Earth Day as we can, and we'll gather virtually, and we'll work on these priorities nonstop. So take care. Bye-bye.